That night, the house felt like a magnificent, silent tomb. Rain lashed against the French windows of the sprawling villa in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut. But the fury of the storm was nothing compared to the seismic tremor that was about to shatter the foundation of Audrey's 40 perfectly constructed life. Audrey wasn't a woman prone to melodrama. She was a renowned architect, a woman who valued structure, precision, and order. And she had built her marriage to Ethan, 42, a successful corporate lawyer with the same meticulous care. 15 years, 2 successful careers, a brilliant daughter, Anna, a life others envied. Tonight, however, her entire blueprint was about to be rendered obsolete. She had gone to the guest room, the room currently occupied by her younger sister, Chloe, 35, who was supposedly recovering from a minor necessary surgery to drop off a forgotten prescription bottle. The hallway light, a soft, expensive globe imported from Italy, cast long, distorted shadows, giving the scene an eerie theatrical quality. Audrey didn't knock. She never did for Chloe, who was, after all, her little sister, a frequent, welcomed presence in their home. The sight that greeted her, however, was a tableau of betrayal so stark, so utterly uncomplicated, that it stole the breath right out of her lungs. Chloe, her sister, the one she had financially supported through college after their parents passed, lay tangled in the crisp white sheets. Beside her was Ethan, her husband, the man whose hands were supposed to only ever be a source of comfort and familiarity. They were both awake, clearly engaged in a moment of stolen, intimate vulnerability. For a terrifying, endless second, Audrey's mind went blank. The world dissolved into a buzzing white noise. It wasn't the nakedness that shocked her. It was the intimacy, the casual, shared secret, the easy comfort between the two people she was supposed to trust most. It was the crushing realization that this wasn't a one-time drunken mistake. This was a relationship that had blossomed right under the roof she had designed. During the very nights they had told her they were working late or needing space. Chloe's reaction was a study in psychological shift. First, a flicker of pure primal terror, the fear of a child caught stealing. Then, as Audrey remained frozen, silent, Chloe's eyes hardened. It was a defensive, possessive, almost triumphant challenge that seemed to scream, "Yes, it's true. He chose me. What are you going to do now?" Ethan, ever the polished corporate executive, managed a desperate, clumsy fumble for the sheets. His face was a mask of utter self-loathing exposure. Ethan, a strangled whisper, "Audrey, I can explain this. Please don single quotes T. But Audrey couldn't hear him. The sound of his voice felt distant, like a radio signal fading out in a hurricane. Her reaction was not the explosion of fury one would expect in a cheap melodrama, but something far more devastating: negation. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the medicine bottle. She didn't slap anyone. Audrey simply took one slow, deliberate step back. The expensive silk of her robe brushed against the wooden doorframe with a faint whisper, the only sound louder than her own violently pounding heart. Her eyes, those intelligent, analytical eyes, traveled from her sister's face to her husband's, and in that gaze was a sentence of complete, silent termination. The love was not replaced by hate, but by a chilling, absolute emptiness. It was as if the two of them, Ethan and Chloe, had ceased to exist in her reality. She was looking at two strangers, two pieces of the landscape that needed to be surgically removed. Without another word, without acknowledging their existence with so much as a tremor of her lips, Audrey turned her back on the wreckage. Her retreat was not surrender. It was a psychological severing. Each step she took down the long, cold hallway was a deliberate withdrawal from her marriage, from her sister, and from the 15 years she had invested in a lie. The heavy, suffocating silence she left behind was her first profound act of punishment. The architecture of her world had collapsed, and now she had to decide what kind of ruins she wanted to live in. The days that followed the discovery were not marked by screaming matches or hurled accusations. Instead, they descended into a terrifying, psychological silence, a vacuum, where 15 years of shared history seemed to have been violently sucked out. This wasn't a domestic dispute. It was a clinical study in emotional estrangement. Audrey, the master architect, retreated completely into her inner fortress. She didn't seek counsel, didn't pack a bag, and, most chillingly, didn't issue an ultimatum. She simply continued to exist within the house, but she had walled herself off from the man who shared her name and their bed. Ethan, desperate and psychologically flailing, tried everything. He followed her from the kitchen island to the library, his attempts at conversation clumsy and loud in the cavernous space. Ethan, a pleading, low rumble. Audrey, please. Just yell at me. Throw something. Let me apologize, truly. Let me explain the hell I've been living in, ... double quotes. Audrey's response was always the same, a glacial, unwavering lack of acknowledgement. She moved around him, past him, her routine perfectly intact. She woke at 6, prepared her organic green smoothie, went to her firm, came home, and prepared dinner always exactly enough for 3. Minus Chloe, who had vacated the premises the morning after the incident without a single word to Audrey, only a curt text to Ethan. The meals were the most excruciating part. Ethan would try to fill the void, talking anxiously about market trends, a difficult case, or a meaningless anecdote from the office. Audrey would respond only to their daughter, Anna 16, speaking in the calm, measured tones of a customer service representative, polite, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth for her husband. Audrey to Anna, never glancing at Ethan. Anna, how was your history presentation? Did you remember to use the primary sources we discussed? This cold, absolute negation was the true psychological torture. Ethan longed for the rage, the tears, the signs of a relationship still alive enough to fight. But Audrey's silence was a denial of his very existence, stripping him of the power to defend or explain himself. He was already judged, condemned, and exiled, all within the pristine confines of their home. The deepest wound of this eerie quiet, however, was felt by Anna, a brilliant, highly observant teenager. She absorbed the shift in the house's emotional climate like a sponge. She saw the lines of exhaustion etching themselves around her mother's eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from the immense effort required to maintain this inhuman composure. She saw the desperation in her father's slumped shoulders and his frantic, failing attempts to breach the wall. One rainy afternoon, Ethan reached out to place a comforting hand on Audrey's shoulder. As she was stirring a pot of soup, it was a reflex, an automatic gesture of domestic familiarity. Audrey stopped stirring. The only sound was the drip of condensation from the lid onto the Her head didn't turn, but her voice, when it came, was a razor-sharp whisper that cut through the strained quiet. Audrey, don't touch me, Ethan. She slowly, deliberately, pulled her shoulder away, as if she were detaching herself from something soiled. Audrey, her voice hardening slightly, you betrayed me. That's a wound I can possibly endure. But what is truly unforgivable is that you have polluted the trust of your daughter. She sees everything, and your silence now is only proving to her that you are not worth fighting for. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was an act of psychological warfare waged with absolute truth. She wasn't just grieving the loss of a husband. She was mourning the loss of the secure reality she had given her child. And in that terrifying silence, Ethan realized his fate was no longer in Audrey's hands, but in the hands of the young woman who watched them both from the shadows. Anna, her quiet observation was the ticking clock on his sentence. The tension culminated on a night that should have been a celebration, Ethan's 42nd birthday. Audrey, with her chilling commitment to appearances, had insisted on preparing a full, elaborate dinner, complete with Ethan's parents' tacit, brutal reminder of the reputation he stood to lose. The atmosphere was thick, less a family gathering and more a carefully staged interrogation. Ethan's parents, sensing the Arctic chill, offered strained platitudes, completely unaware of the true catastrophe unfolding. After the strained, meticulously portioned meal, and just before the toast the moment, Ethan had secretly pinned all his hopes on for a tearful apology and perhaps a reprieve. Anna 16 rose from her seat. She didn't have the practiced smoothness of a corporate lawyer or the guarded elegance of an architect. Her presence was purely, terrifyingly real. Anna, her voice low, steady, and dangerously calm. Before we raise our glasses to Dad's health, I have a gift. She didn't hand him a wrapped box. Instead, she placed her sleek smartphone on the pristine white tablecloth, angling the screen so it faced her father, visible to everyone. The video that began to play was not scandalous footage of the affair, but something far more intimate and ruinous, a psychological indictment. It was a montage Anna had secretly compiled. It started with old, sun-drenched photos of Ethan and Audrey, then faded into grainy, close-up shots of Audrey over the last few weeks, her hollowed eyes staring into the darkness of her home office, her hand trembling as she discarded the first wedding gift they had ever received. The audio track was the real weapon, a recording of Audrey's journal entries, read by Anna herself, detailing the slow, painful realization of the betrayal, and the subsequent psychological effort to maintain her perfect facade. Anna's voice, reading from her mother's journal. I used to believe our life was a fortress. Now, I know it was just a sketch on cheap paper. He didn't just break the rules. He defiled the very materials I used to build our world. The pain isn't the sex. It's the sheer architectural cruelty of his deception. The video concluded with a tight shot of Audrey, sitting alone, a single, silent tear tracing a path down her cheek, a tear Ethan had never been allowed to see. When the video cut to black, the dining room was paralyzed. The only movement was the flickering candlelight reflecting in the tears of Ethan's mother. Anna's eyes, the color of stormy gray inherited from her mother, locked onto Ethan's. Anna, blink, Dad, breathe. You just witnessed the wreckage of the woman you promised to protect. But that's not your punishment. Your punishment is this. She reached beneath the table and produced a meticulously drafted, bound document, complete with a title page and numbered clauses, looking every bit the legal agreement her father would draft for a major client. Anna, she didn't ask, she dictated. This is a 5-year matrimonial reassessment contract. I drafted it with Mom's silence as my only legal counsel. The goal is not divorce, but psychological accountability. She slid the document across the table. Ethan, shaking violently, finally lifted the crisp pages. The terms were staggering in their cold brilliance. Divestiture of capital. Ethan must immediately transfer the majority ownership of all shared assets and the marital home to Audrey and Anna, establishing a monetary foundation for their independence. This secures Mom's freedom. Physical estrangement, the ghost clause. Ethan is granted permission to remain in the home, but only as a tenant. He must maintain absolute physical and emotional distance from Audrey. No touch, no unsolicited communication, no claim to her as his wife. He must live as a ghost in the life he destroyed. Mandatory reparation. For the next 5 years, Ethan must fulfill every reasonable wish Audrey expresses, from the mundane to the aspirational, without question, complaint, or delay. He must help her launch her private gallery, her deferred dream, and cultivate the rose garden she always wanted but never had time for. He must use his physical presence to rebuild her life, piece by tedious piece. Consequence of failure: any violation of these clauses constitutes a breach, triggering immediate, uncontested divorce proceedings and the permanent forfeiture of his parental visitation rights with Anna. Ethan stared at the contract, realizing this was not an offer of reconciliation, but a life sentence delivered by his own child. It was a punishment infinitely worse than simple financial ruin. It stripped him of his dignity, his title, and his agency, forcing him to witness Audrey's ascent to freedom while he served as her silent, willing laborer. He gripped the expensive pen she offered, his hand shaking so violently the ink splattered. Ethan, a broken whisper, addressing the paper, I sign. Anna watched him, her expression unchanging. She wasn't consumed by vengeance, but by a chilling, clear-eyed sense of justice. She had ensured that her father's penance would not be fleeting pain, but the slow, agonizing process of forced self-reflection. Her punishment was to make him fall in love again, not with his wife, but with the life she represented, and then deny him the right to reclaim it. The signing of the matrimonial reassessment contract marked not an ending, but the beginning of a bizarre, meticulously managed new life. The sprawling Connecticut villa, once a symbol of their unity, became a stage for Audrey's quiet revolution and Ethan's prolonged public penance. Ethan's transition into the role of the silent caretaker was agonizing in its detail. He, the high-powered lawyer who commanded million-dollar contracts, now lived under the oppressive weight of a 16-year handwritten clauses. The most immediate and humiliating challenge was Clause 2, the ghost clause. He would wake up in the separate guest suite, which felt less like a bedroom and more like a minimalist prison cell. Knowing Audrey was just down the hall, inaccessible, he would see her across the breakfast table, flawlessly dressed for her architectural firm, and she would meet his eye only to ensure he registered her absolute emotional detachment. There were no accidental brushes, no lingering eye contact, and no familiar domestic sounds. Their home was now partitioned by an invisible, yet impenetrable, glass wall. The crux of the psychological torment lay in Clause 3, mandatory reparation. Audrey, seizing the power Anna had so cleverly handed her, began to live a life fueled by long-deferred desires. Her first decree, the Rose Garden. Ethan, in his expensive Italian suits, spent his weekends supervising landscape architects, then, humiliatingly, digging the rich, dark soil himself. The absurdity of a corporate titan meticulously tending to hybrid tea roses in the rain was not lost on him, and Audrey made sure to observe his toil from the sunroom, a cool, satisfied spectator. Next was the gallery. Audrey had always harbored the dream of promoting emerging female artists. Ethan used his considerable legal and financial network not for his firm, but to secure a prime commercial space downtown, negotiate the lease, and fund the entire renovation, all for a venture that would absorb his time and resources but yield Audrey complete creative independence from him. He was the architect of her liberation. The hardest part was the slow, forced intimacy of his actions. He was performing all the acts of a deeply devoted partner, the provision, the nurturing, the support, but stripped of the title, the affection, or the hope of reward. He was building her a beautiful, separate life that he would never be invited to share. He watched Audrey start to flourish. She found her laugh again, a genuine, unrestrained sound that often came when she was speaking to Anna or an artist, but never when she addressed him. Her eyes, once tired and burdened, began to sparkle with the fierce, focused light of a woman finally pursuing her true passion. Anna, the silent co-conspirator, became the barometer of his success. She was the one who enforced the contract, her presence a constant, sober reminder of the gravity of his mistake. She did not express affection. Instead, she measured his compliance. Anna, observing him wipe down the granite counter after dinner, "Dad, you missed a spot." Clause 3 is about meticulous fulfillment. Meticulous? He would simply nod, the shame a bitter taste in his mouth, and wipe the spot again. The psychological genius of Anna's sentence was this. It forced Ethan to fall back in love not with his memory of Audrey, but with the vibrant, self-possessed woman she was becoming without him. He had to care for her, provide for her, and witness her happiness, all while knowing that his actions were only widening the chasm between them. His utility was the only thing keeping him tethered to their lives, and that utility was purely in service of her freedom. 5 years stretched ahead, an eternity of silent service. Ethan was no longer the master of his domain. He was a penitent, constructing the gilded cage of his own solitude, watching the woman he betrayed and still, heartbreakingly, loved fly free. The question wasn't if Audrey would leave him after the 5 years, but whether Ethan, after rebuilding her completely, would even recognize the man left behind to claim his freedom. The 5 years passed, marked not by dramatic conflict, but by the quiet accumulation of fulfilled obligations. Ethan built the gallery, nurtured the roses, and managed Audrey's every logistical need. He transformed from a powerful executive to a meticulous, almost invisible attendant. Audrey, meanwhile, thrived. Her gallery became successful, her self-worth restored, and the burden of betrayal finally lifted, replaced by the weight of her own solid achievements. Anna graduated high school, choosing a university far from home, her final necessary step towards full independence from the wreckage of her childhood. The day the contract expired arrived with a profound, almost terrifying stillness. No grand meeting was scheduled. The moment was marked only by the absence of obligation. Audrey walked into Ethan's guest suite the first time she had willingly entered his private space in half a decade. Ethan, sitting at his desk, looked up, his face etched with a quiet dignity born of long suffering. No longer the arrogant man who had been caught years ago. Audrey, her voice soft, calm, possessing the authority of closure. The contract is done, Ethan. Ethan simply nodding. I know. He didn't plead. He didn't ask if she would take him back. He only waited, finally free to leave, but bound by a curious, aching attachment to the life he had spent 5 years perfecting for someone else. Audrey, you have fulfilled every clause. The house is legally mine, the gallery is secure, and I am, whole. You are free to go. To start over. With Chloe, or whoever you choose. Ethan, he looked around the sterile room. Then back at her. I don't have a choice, Audrey. I lost that 5 years ago. I spent 5 years building your future, and in doing so, I realized I destroyed the only life I truly wanted. I learned to respect you, to care for you, in ways I never did when you were actually my wife. He stood up, walking toward the door. Not towards freedom, but towards the unknown. Ethan, I'm leaving, but not to find someone else. I'm leaving because for you to truly be free, I have to be completely gone. He walked out, leaving the house and the life he had spent the last 5 years reconstructing. A self-imposed exile, that was his final, deepest act of penance. Audrey stood in the empty room, looking at the meticulous order he left behind, realizing that Anna's cruel, brilliant sentence had not just punished Ethan. It had healed Audrey and, in the process, defined the true, impossible cost of betrayal. The counselor's reflection. Advice for the American reader. This story, though dramatic, speaks to profound psychological truths common in high-stakes American domestic dramas, especially concerning wealth, reputation, and familial loyalty. For Audrey the betrayed, your move was a brilliant, structural act of self-preservation. You didn't engage in destructive emotional warfare. You engaged in strategic retreat and forced reparations. The takeaway? Prioritize your freedom and financial autonomy over immediate revenge. By forcing Ethan to invest his time and capital into your future, the gallery, the home transfer, you secured a future where his presence was no longer necessary for your stability. Your psychological healing was tied to your independence. The ultimate power move is to build a beautiful life that requires no reconciliation. For Ethan the penitent, your experience highlights the painful realization that apologies are cheap. Sustained, visible change is the only currency for redemption. Anna's contract forced you into performance-based penance, which is far more effective than simple regret. The takeaway, you didn't just apologize with words. You apologized with 5 years of action. You learned that true love and respect often manifest not in grand gestures, but in the meticulous, selfless service to your partner's well-being and dreams. If you have betrayed trust, understand that the relationship is dead. Your focus must shift to helping the person you hurt find peace, even if that peace is without you. That is true, mature accountability. For Anna the executor, you stepped into a vacuum of adult responsibility, and while your solution was drastic, it was effective. You protected your mother and forced your father into accountability. The takeaway: your generation is often tasked with mediating the failures of your parents. You proved that emotional maturity often means designing boundaries and consequences, where adults have failed to do so. However, remember to eventually release the role of the judge. You have secured your mother's freedom. Now, focus on your own new life, and allow yourself to heal, without carrying the weight of their past. Your ultimate goal is not their reconciliation, but your own peace.